Hello, very beautiful community. Sorry to be with you so late today or tomorrow, whenever you're watching this. For health reasons, I couldn't join you earlier. But Trump's parade had gold, had crypto ads. It had, therefore, that weird whiff of neoliberal imperial decline, sponsored by Palantir, and generally very underwhelming. And a couple of people emailed in and asked, well, Vlad, you've seen the Soviet Union in its late stages. You've seen late Soviet parades. Was there anything like that? And if it wasn't like Soviet parades, maybe it was a bit like the late Soviet Union, this sort of rather pathetic, underwhelming image. I do think that late Soviet parades, and I remember 4 or 5 of the May parades from the 80s, I left in December 1990. Now, before the Soviet Union collapsed. The parades were very underwhelming. But they weren't underwhelming because they looked like trumps. They looked impressive. What was underwhelming about them was that they, in fact, accentuated the decline and stated incapacity all around you, despite the shiny parade. So the parade was like somebody whose house has fallen apart parading their brand new refrigerator when they don't even have a place to plug it in because there are no walls. And so there was something very pathetic about that, which even meant that people were being sort of glib and dismissive even of the relatively high-tech military machinery. I mean, among my friends, all the jokes were that, all of this army stuff that we're seeing parade down the street would be defeated in military confrontation with just a relatively small West European country. That wasn't true, but it's how we felt and how we spoke. There was a real whiff of decline around the parades, even though the parades themselves looked relatively impressive. The nature of Soviet decline, in the widest historical terms, was about elites losing legitimacy and not having the capacity to do anything about their loss of legitimacy. So it's a legitimacy/capacity crisis. And did the parade give us a whiff of something like that happening in the United States? Did it evoke that to some degree? Well, I think it did. It revealed Trump's political incapacity. And Trump's political incapacity, because Trump is in office in virtue of the Democrats' political incapacity, inevitably is tied, causally tied, historically tied to the incapacity of the Democrats. So the United States does have a crisis where its elites are out of touch with the population and don't have the capacity to fix this. Now, I'm not the first one to talk about this. A few people have talked about it in a nicely provocative way, including my beloved public intellectual John Gray, who wrote a little piece about this for the New Statesman in August, when the Dems were transitioning from Biden to Kamala Harris. So what can we say about this? Big picture terms, technocratic centrist politics, center-left or center-right, has basically lost credibility and can never regain it. The West is like the Soviet Union in the sense that if you put aside for a moment authoritarian populism, right, and you look at what institutional politics, constitutional politics you have left, you've just got technocratic centrism. And so the West is like the Soviet Union in its late phase in the sense that technocratic centrism will only lead to more authoritarian populism and therefore will lead to democratic decline. It's unlike the Soviet Union in the sense that it was salvageable. It is salvageable. Western politics is salvageable. It's not likely to happen, but in theory, a political project could be proposed that reconnected elites with the population, with citizens, and restored a degree of trust in institutions. It's a great question what that project would look like. It would need to be pro-institutional, but populist at the same time. It would need to be left-wing on some issues, particularly economic issues. It would require a great degree of what political philosophers might call economic democratization. It would require some center-right positions on issues like immigration. So it's going to be a very interesting mix if it is ever proposed. And it would have to be something like that mix. There aren't really many options. Unless you offer something like the mix that we'll talk about in more detail, you're just not going to win and then offer responsible politics. You could win, but offer irresponsible politics. And the latest machinations in the Dem Party just accentuate the capacity and legitimacy crisis more. Biden's cognitive decline was in plain sight, but attempted to be hidden. It was an unelected elite that came in and pushed Biden out of office and replaced him with Kamala Harris, something that some of the unelected elites, like the Obamas, didn't want. They wanted a competitive process, and I recommended on the main channel a competitive process rather than installing Kamala Harris, no matter how late in the day it was. And then, having been installed, the narrative was presented about Kamala Harris that was clearly at odds with who she was. She wasn't the president of the United States. I think she could have won if her campaign was structured perfectly because Trump was so weak. And again, it's an absolutely clear calamity for the Democrats, the last election. It's not a Trump victory. Trump lost the election. The Democrats just lost it more. So because Trump was so weak, he was beatable. If Trump had been a strong candidate, nobody, not even Barack Obama, could have won for the Democrats in this historical moment. If Trump had been Orban, Obama would have lost to him. Or Putin in political pedigree. So we have this transition that had the whiff of democratic illegitimacy about it. There's nothing illegal about it, but it had a whiff of democratic illegitimacy about it. A sort of a quasi-puppet candidate, a questionable process, following a situation where a very significant disability that the president had that affected his functioning in office was in plain sight but denied. A situation where some of Biden's actual politics was more progressive and more effective than Obama's politics, but his administration lacked the communicative capacity to actually make the case for what they were doing. Some of it was good. And then on the other hand, you have an alternative that is entirely unconstructive. You have either moderate Republicans, a dying breed, who have all the faults of the Democrats in being aligned with technocratic centrism, and then you have Trump, an exclusionary, entrepreneurial, post-truth, anti-constitutional, authoritarian populist. Everything Trump does domestically weakens trust in institutions. Everything Trump does on the foreign stage weakens America. So the alternative is natural, right? You lurch somewhere as a country when the main project being offered is just a car in mud with spinning wheels. That probably, apart from the fleeting hyperliberal ideology of wokeism that is now expiring, had nothing new to offer relative to a decade ago, relative to the 90s. Perhaps you could say the Biden administration was less neoliberal than previous administrations, but it wasn't a sea change, and it certainly wasn't narrated as such, because the administration couldn't narrate its own politics at all. And then you have this gross irresponsibility on the Trumpist side, and that's all you've got. And when you have such democratic decay, what happens is what happened with the Soviet Union. Your foreign policy collapses. Right? Trump tried to stop 2 wars. Now he's got 3 going on his cards as of the last couple of days. Trump has not just bad ideas when it comes to foreign policy, but no ideas at all. He doesn't have the capacity to put together a plan, get it properly discussed with his team, get advice. Trump is incapable of receiving advice because of his narcissistic personality disorder, because he can't listen to anyone telling him that he doesn't know something. We saw this dramatically with the tariffs, where folks around Trump could not tell him what the outcomes were going to be, so they just had to do it. So when you have domestic incapacity, your foreign policy melts down. And it's because Western democracies are weakening that the global order is melting down. Now, the big difference between this and the late Soviet period is, apart from all the other differences that are obvious, right? We've got fairly well-functioning states still. We've got fairly flourishing democracy. So this is a cartoonish comparison. It's just a comparison for a very limited purpose. But even within that limited purpose, the comparison has limitations. And the limitations are basically that Gorbachev or anybody trying to revive the Soviet experiment would have been a tragic figure because it wasn't doable. Gorbachev's vision for a kind of European Union on the ex-Soviet space, as Ukrainians today might tell you, they wouldn't want to be in the European Union with Russia, was not a viable project, dramatically underestimated the nationalist forces at hand. But today, you can absolutely not stop democratic decline in the West, but offer a constructive political project that slows the collapse in trust, that reconnects populations with elites better, that restores a degree of trust in elites in institutions. You can do that. And that's the disanalogy with the Soviet experiment, that we have that option available to us. And if we don't take it in the next 20 years, it's because we, collectively, our polities, simply weren't able to do something that was difficult but possible. What Mr. Gorbachev was trying to do was impossible. So that's an important difference. But if you want to make the loose analogy and say, we've got a crisis of legitimacy, we've got a crisis of capacity where all the elites lack legitimacy and all the elites lack capacity, that's a plausible and illuminated, if hyperbolic comparison, right? It's obviously hyperbolic. In the Soviet Union in the late 80s, you had to phone 7 shops to find one that had cheese or butter. We're not going to get there. That's not where we are. But at the level of legitimacy, capacity, there are vibes that resonate. Enough. Lots of love.